Hello, this is Booksellets, and I am Prometheus, and finally, now that it's nearly the end of January, I can talk about the books that I was reading in December and finished in early January. And that would be Apocalypse Never, Why Environmental Alarmism Hurts Us All by Michael Shellenberger, and Mathematics by the Barron's College Review series Calculus by Elliot C. Gootman, Ph.D. I want to start with this book first because I think this is the first one I finished. I have had this book since 2020, I believe, and calculus has always kind of been that thing that I'll eventually have to get to, but never really comprehended. Funny squiggles, D's everywhere for no apparent reason that had no associated number value, and it was just all a very confusing mess. And I put it off for as long as I possibly could until I started wanting to do my own calculations, and the calculations for plasma physics turns out to involve quite a bit of calculus. A lot of calculus. And so I decided, you know what? I got a book about this. I should start reading it. And so I did. And this book is definitely it definitely helped. For one, I now have a somewhat idea of why all those D's are there and what those funny little S's mean. And it is not a book that you read all the way through in the classical sense of the word. It is a book that you read a chapter and mind melted it, and then you reread the chapter and you're like, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. And then you read the next chapter and you're like, yep, I'm totally lost. And then you read both chapters again. So it is a very in-depth book. I mean, it's barely a few hundred pages. It's barely 300 pages long, but I feel like my comprehension of calculus is better, but then again, I could just be on that curve. What's it called? The Gootman curve? I don't know. That's that book, and I highly enjoyed it. Highly recommend it for anybody who just wants to try and dip their toes in for calculus. And then Apocalypse Never by Michael Shellenberger. I believe this was recommended by a booktuber. I'll have Ariane put the name of them in. This book is very, very good, and I highly recommend reading it. It goes into detail how maybe all those industrial factories aren't as bad for the environment as we thought. Maybe there's some other motives behind the environmental groups. Maybe the world will not end. Maybe we will survive, and maybe, just maybe, we could actually be making the world a better place, and not through solar panels. They'll have their place, they're just not going to be good for every place, nor should they be enforced in that way. And that's all I can say with spoilers. So if you want to read more on global warming and have a more left-leaning political view on the environmental movement, yet still advocating for nuclear power and mass factory building, I highly recommend this book. From now on, spoilers. These are different notes that I picked up through it that I found fascinating. And one of the things that he talked about was Bill Newsom? No, not Bill Newsom, sorry. Wrong side of the card. Jerry Brown and his work in the anti-nuclear program. Well, it turns out he was a bit anti-nuclear before that. It turns out that his father, Edmund Brown, after he had his time in office as governor, was approached by, what was the name of it? Pantan? He was approached by the Indonesian state-owned government for oil, and with the recently passed air cleaning protection acts, because Indonesian oil had a lower sulfur content than American oil, it could be processed at a cheaper price, which gave California a massive boost so they could burn more of it to a certain extent, because carbon dioxide wasn't regulated at the time, which was very convenient. So Jerry Brown nixed several nuclear plants, but he also nixed oil that Chevron was making that would have imported a Alaskan oil into the county, and that plan was nixed for that oil refinery. And apparently there was a political aide by Richard Mueller, Mullir, of California Energy Commissions, who used to be a political aide, pressures the utility companies to burn more oil instead of switching to nuclear power. Yeah, and the person who cut down the Chevron Alaskan oil refinery was Tom Quinn, who was a promoter, who was a campaign manager, and then was promoted to the California Air Resources Board, direct to change air regulations. I just think that's interesting. Also, it goes a little further. There was Bill Newsom, who was a Getty Oil executive investor who raised political contributions for Edmund and Jerry Brown, and was raised to a state superior court judge and lobbied for Getty Oil for the Getty Oil family money to be maintained as non-taxable, which meant that he was helping Jerry Brown get money at a non-taxed rate. Crazy. Oh yeah, there's it. The company in Indonesia was called Pertain. When the general who was running that company was ousted from power and the oil boom collapsed, liquidated natural gas was built on the coast of California, and they started importing that from Indonesia. Also, there was the result of the Pacific Gas and Electric Company, which is owned under another company on which Jerry Brown's sister Caitlin Brown owes, and they had issues with a decommissioned nuke that was then charged, which the rates for decommissioning that nuke was closed early, and $3 billion were paid by the taxpayers, and another $1 billion by investors to close down the nuclear factory, which was not entirely legal, which led to a federal investigation and raid on the company headquarters, which was then stalled by Kamala Harris. And there also may have been documents destroyed by the attorneys of this company in relevance to a natural gas explosion in an underground reservoir which killed 8 Pacific Gas and Electric employees. That's a hot mess. And just something of weird note, on page 232, apparently there was a, sorry, let me back up. In the 1870s, there was a mass starvation famine in India. Britain was technically partially responsible for that. I'm not really sure what I was expecting after learning about the potato famines, but apparently the Indian rations that the British were giving rations to the Indians, apparently the caloric intake was lower than what you could expect to get in Hitler death camps before you got killed. What the heck? That was just something I found personally fascinating, but that's spoilers over. I highly recommend these 2 books. If you watched it to the end, I'm glad. Hope I didn't spoil too much. Both these books I highly recommend reading, and I've got to do a haul.